Now, I am extraordinarily pleased to welcome Sarah Holland to our programme. Sarah is a lecturer at the University of Nottingham, and she's also the co-convener of History UK. Some of you will be familiar with that august institution. She is an expert on rural health and local history from the 19th century in particular. And her talk this evening is going to combine all three in a way, I hope. And this is some work that she has done for her, which is going to be feeding into a new book that she's going to be. What she has was it? Is it finished yet, Sarah? Is it close to finishing? The smile there suggests that
It's very close. Yes, let's say it's very close.
it will be with us presently. Is the so this is a kind of a sneak preview of that research and that for that book. So we're extraordinarily pleased to have Sarah on board this evening to introduce us to this, which has been, as I say, a very popular talk, and we've sold a huge amount of tickets for it. So, and I've had a sneak preview, so I know that it's going to be terrific, and I'm just going to hand over to Sarah now and allow her to wow us all.
Thank you, Stu, and thank you everyone for coming along. It's my pleasure to be here. Hopefully, I am sharing my slides again now. So that's
all good, all good,
all good. We are brilliant. Okay, I am just going to switch my camera off though, so I'm not. Okay, thank you everyone. So yes, it's my great pleasure to be sharing this research, and particularly to be foregrounding the voices of those who are so often marginalised. The focus of the talk is patient voices from the asylum, but specifically the role of farming as therapy in the institution in the 19th and early 20th century. And this includes the ideas that framed even having farming, why are there farms in these institutions, to the patients who experienced it, and understanding how we get those voices, because sadly we often don't have the letters or the diaries of people who were in these institutions talking about those experiences. They may exist somewhere, but they're often not archived. But we do have other sources which allow us to access those experiences and even those voices, which I'm going to talk about during this talk. So to begin with, and to give some context, to think about why on earth do they have these farms in these institutions in the 19th century? And the asylums are obviously the 19th century psychiatric institutions. Largely, some of the language I'll be using is extremely dated, talking about lunacy, lunatics, etc. But essentially, we're talking about mental illness and psychiatric institutions in the 19th century and the early 20th century. So during the 19th century, farming was heralded as being this therapeutic activity for patients, something that would benefit both the mind and the body, and they were particularly interested in that relationship between the two of them. In 1847, the commissioners in lunacy who oversaw the pauper lunatic asylums set out rules for selecting the site of an asylum, and they stated it should be of a perfectly healthy character and have adequate land to afford the patients ample means of exercise and recreation, as well as healthful employment outdoors. The commissioners asserted there's employment in agricultural labour and in gardening, and recreation in the open air were the most advantageous, as they tend to not only occupy the mind, but to improve the bodily strength and promote a healthy state of natural functions. So as I say, that relationship between mind and body was incredibly important during the 19th century. And as such, they recommended that the ratio of land should be at least 1 acre to 10 patients. Now, the exact amount varies from institution to institution and often exceeded that considerably, which I'll talk about a little bit as we go on. So during this period, we get a number of other people either emphasising the points that the lunacy commissioners had made, influencing what some of the lunacy commissioners were saying and really getting this point across. And it's replicated. They say it all slightly differently, but they're all basically saying the same thing. So, for instance, the sentiments are echoed by John Connolly, who's a prominent alienist and medical superintendent who writes several books on asylums and related matters during this period. This one being published in the middle of the 19th century. And he asserts that recovery rates were far greater for male patients who were working on the farm compared to those engaged in the workshops, on account of it being more active, more varied, and therefore more remedial. Other key texts on mental disease and insanity also say this, basically. So Bucknell and Tuke, who are pictured there with their third edition of their manual, which was published in 1874, argue that work on the land is simply the best. It aids physical and mental health. And several others talk about this. So Clark's Clinical Manual of Mental Disease also highlighted better sleep, appetite and digestion for the patients as well. It's worth noting, though, that the farms were quite gendered spaces, with far more male than female patients working on them or having the opportunity to work on them, with more female patients employed in the laundry. Now, that's not to say no women worked on the farm, nor indeed in other outdoor occupations. So there was a slight distinction between the farm and the gardening activities, even though there was a lot of overlap in terms of the activities as well. But this led Bucknell and Tuke to advocate for greater opportunities for women to engage in outdoor work. They referred to the monotony of the laundry and acknowledged that although not all farm work might be appropriate, that women should share the advantages of working outdoors. They wrote about that although they might not work in the field, surely they might be more employed than they are in the garden and even on the farm. The dairy, the piggery, and the poultry yard come fairly within the conventional sphere of women's duties and would supply to females in our asylums varied work and interest, which could not fail to be beneficial and restorative. Now, it's worth noting that in this talk, I'm largely drawing on male patient experiences to sort of tell a narrative that those sources allow us to see. That's not to say that in terms of the wider research and the book, that I'm ignoring those female patient experiences, but there's far more of them, and partially that's the way in which the evidence was recorded at the time and the preoccupations of the people creating those sources, which I'll talk about during the talk, mean that they predominantly are linking it to men, even where we've got other records talking about women working on the land. If we're looking for their actual experiences and their voice, we often don't get that connection, unfortunately. Although there are some exceptions. So these ideas of therapy and working on the land and nature being good for the mind and the body predate the 19th century. From at least the 18th century onwards, we get this idea of a therapeutic landscape. And as well as being in the spaces, simply being able to see the spaces or engage with nature in some form, experience nature in some form, was considered important and often a part of that, an integral part of that institutional design. So, for instance, the York Retreat, the setting of the institution, almost quite domestic, very picturesque, was important. We see that in a number of the private institutions as well. So Brislington House is a key example of both the architecture and the picturesque landscapes being designed specifically to be therapeutic. In addition, though, and this then translated into the design of some of the public pauper lunatic asylums from the middle of the 19th century onwards, we also get the idea that just looking out onto the landscape. Now, an awful lot of these new 19th century asylums, particularly after the 1845 legislation, were built in countryside locations. There was more land there, the land was cheaper for expansion. So when there's this big increase in provision of these institutions, many of them are in the countryside, not all of them, but many of them. And that meant they had that natural advantage of having agricultural land where people could work, but also this idea that people could see out of the wards into to look at nature. The other idea also was that you take nature into the wards. So you see a lot of this idea of putting plants on the wards, and people experiencing nature that way as well. And this was seen as being particularly important, and almost revolutionary, because although now we know that being in nature, gardening are really good for people, these early ideas were removed from the idea of mechanical restraint. So the mechanical restraints that we've got on the far side of the image are replicas of those that were at Hanwell Asylum, and that's where John Connolly worked. And he was determined that there would be a move from those mechanical restraints. The medications and the treatments are fairly primitive at this date, and therefore the idea of being able to go into a landscape and work and use that energy in a productive way was seen as incredibly important and positive. And this is where that idea of work as moral therapy, including farm work, emerges from. So it's rather a practical and a humane alternative to what went before. Work, therefore, becomes this cornerstone of treatment and pivotal to the experiences that many patients would have in these institutions. Whatever that work be, they'd be put to work in some way as soon as possible. Farm work was particularly considered to be aligned to these principles because it did signify the mind and the body being able to improve, and a connection with nature and morality as well. Of course, the rationale for having the farm was extremely positive and embraces these ideas of therapy. But it was also linked to self-sufficiency, and even profitability as well, because they could trade surplus produce. It could lower the cost per patient as well. And there's lots of debates about how economical it was to have a farm and how productive the patients were as well. There were some concerns from the outset, though, that these farms were becoming too large, and even some of the medical superintendents were more interested in, they knew more about farming than they did about the medical arrangements. And you get quite a lot of accusations during the 19th century about that. Although it isn't until the 1930s and ultimately 1954 that a critique of these farms really takes hold, questioning why these institutions had such large farms. Interestingly, you might have heard of occupational therapy, including crafts and training in the 1920s and 30s onwards. And there was some interesting tensions in that period between the farm and the new ideas about occupational therapy as well. Largely because many of the people running these institutions said, well, we've already got occupational therapy, it's farming, it's gardening, these things are great for the patients, they've worked for years. But the people in charge, overseeing the whole system, said they wanted to sort of basically disconnect the work from economic elements as well. So they didn't want that idea of people making a profit from the work as well. Although that in itself becomes complex because they started selling some of the things that they made as part of occupational therapy as well. It's also not very clear, just as an aside, whether some of the medical superintendents actually misunderstood what was meant, or they were actually actively resisting it because they wanted their farms to continue. But it was ambiguous, and asylum and hospital farms would remain a feature of these institutions until their closure in the second half of the 20th century. But the key question then is how did patients experience this then? So we've got a picture there, the patients being asked to sort of pose there. They're alongside agricultural workers who were paid and employed by the institution, who worked alongside the patients on a day-to-day basis. And we have lots of records which help us experience this. They're often articulated by medical superintendents, though, who want to show that it's a success. So they develop an institutional narrative around the advantages of farm labour, telling everybody how healthy it is, how curative it is, and how actually the patients actively sought to do this work as well. So this extract from the Lincolnshire County Lunatic Asylum annual report in 1870 really emphasises that because most of the patients were from agricultural backgrounds, and that was the thing they knew, agriculture, then they would automatically ask to work on the farm as soon as possible. And I'll talk about some examples where that is the case, and we've got patients who are requesting farm work simply because that's what they know. But it's a lot more complex than that. They're using this to show the success of the farms and the advantages, but also to show that it is a positive in their sort of institution, because obviously these annual reports are full of all sorts of things, including some negative aspects as well. So this is something quite positive, and they really want to push how important it is and why it's important. And they do so not just during the 19th century, but they continue to do this into the 20th century as well. If we're looking for understanding the patients, we're going to find it, as I say, in these institutional records, but sometimes we can find it through the patients themselves, the people who we see here. They articulate their experiences through their acceptance and requests to work, but their resistance, their extreme reactions, and occasionally through handwritten letters, either papers they've just produced in the institution, which were never intended for another audience, or indeed things that they were sending to other people as well, that have been preserved as part of those case notes or other patient records. The extent to which they align with those institutional narratives vary considerably. And it's important to note it is not just the work that makes a difference here. Obviously, it includes their own personal circumstances, both in and out of the institution, but also their medical condition as well. And that however great farm work is, however beneficial it is, inevitably there are a lot of other things going on, which mean it may not actually lead to them improving mentally. The patient voice was often appropriated as well. So where a patient does articulate it in their own words and maybe writes a letter and says something very positive, the institution is very quick to appropriate this. So here we've got an example of appropriating the patient voice for the annual reports, where the medical superintendent is using letters from patients or family members declaring the positive impact of farm work to amplify that institutional rhetoric. So in the 4th annual report of the Wiltshire County Asylum, Dr. Thurnham includes extracts from these patients' letters saying that it's gratifying to know that the care and attention which they receive are in many instances gratefully appreciated and acknowledged by the inmates. It's quite interesting language there, because at this date they often called patients inmates, but he manages to call them patients and inmates in the same extract here as well. The particular example is this one. The patient is anonymously referred to as number 487, and talks about a letter to his wife, saying, "I am happy to say that I soon got better here. I went to chapel a few days after I came, and I've been every morning since. And I goes out into the field every day and makes myself quite happy, and hopes to be home again soon." And then goes on to talk a little bit more about his experiences. Likewise, the medical superintendent of Worcester Asylum wrote in the 1st annual report for Powick Asylum in 1854 of a young man who, after discharge, wrote to request work on the asylum farm. This was stated to be at the man's own urgent request, and apparently from a sincere desire to show his gratitude for the benefits received during his residence in the asylum. He successfully applied to be an assistant farm servant, which is a position, the medical superintendent comments, that he holds with much pleasure to himself and advantage to the institution. Now, although in both instances the patient voice is being appropriated, and we'll never quite know how many opposing views were there that aren't articulated, these are carefully curated, but are from patient letters. So it's our first sort of insight into how we can get that patient voice. Now, ironically, if we go to a very institutional source, the case notes, here we can actually see the sort of the nuance of the patient voice and the patient experience slightly more than we get from their actual letters to a certain extent. And that's because although they are mediated through that institutional lens, Case notes can provide invaluable insights into the treatment and experience of patients, including the ways in which they narrated or navigated institutional spaces. Maintaining case notes becomes mandatory after the 1845 Lunacy Act, although some institutions have been keeping them for some time before this, including quite detailed notes as well. They perform different functions. So they've got a medical, a bureaucratic, legal role that they play, and they become increasingly detailed as time goes on. Now, of course, references to farm work or indeed any work are often fleeting in nature and inconsistent in content. The case notes as a whole are often reflecting the preoccupations of the institution and the doctor rather than a complete patient history. They can be used to reaffirm institutional narratives about work. However, if we understand case notes at their fullest, they are a product of construction and reconstruction. They're a two-way process of negotiation between the alienist and the patient. They're often based on dialogues with the patient. They often include quotes from the patient. And by revisiting case notes and reading against the grain, these experiences and voices come to the fore. And this is particularly important because if we only look for letters and diaries, which are the minority of ways to access these voices, then we are silencing people who were often silenced at the time. So by being quite creative with our methodologies and looking at these sources, we can look beyond that and really find them coming to the foreground. It's worth noting that we often know the patients' names from these as well, but that many historians agree that whilst it's dehumanizing to take a patient's real name and replace it with a pseudonym, that referring to a patient by their full name is not always appropriate either. So often in published work, it's the sort of the first name and the initial of the surname that historians often use. So there's still slightly anonymous without rendering them the person void of any identity beyond that of a patient. So that's the approach generally I'm adopting here as well. And case notes obviously tell you a little bit of background. So we find out where they're from, their age. We find out sometimes about religion. We find out if they're married. We often find out anything that's been said from a relative as well. Their condition on their admission. We sometimes get photographs, but not always, of the person. And then we get fairly regular entries to start with. And if a person is in an institution for quite a long time, they start to get less frequent as time goes on often as well. We also get inserts, like we can see here, where we've got letters. In this instance, quite a series of letters, including several where the patient was asking his wife to bring strawberries and various other things to him as well whilst he was in the institution. And so collectively, we can use these types of sources, particularly case notes, to extract that voice and explore them. And that's what we're going to talk about for a little while now, and seeing where is that patient voice the strongest. Now, it would seem that the patient voice is the strongest in two main categories. Those patients who are requesting or refusing work, and those for whom work evoked a very strong reaction. On occasions, both of those are entwined with a strong occupational identity, particularly evident in patients who were or had been farmers or farm labourers on admission to the institution. The case notes of Joseph C., an agricultural labourer whose case notes are here, noted that following an improvement in his condition after his admission to Carlton Hayes Asylum in Leicestershire in January 1845, he himself requested to be allowed out-of-door employment from the circumstance of him being an agricultural labourer. As we noted earlier, many superintendents said that, and we do find plenty of evidence where agricultural labourers or farmers do request it, saying it's something they're familiar with and they'd like to be out there. This is perhaps not surprising, because farm work for them would be a familiar point of reference, something that would be familiar in an otherwise new and uncertain circumstances and surroundings. Rural and institutional environments and hierarchies were very different from the institution. But when we actually get on the farm, we found the boundaries are quite blurred. There's agricultural workers, paid agricultural workers working alongside the patients. They're doing a variety of tasks as well. His case notes also highlighted the beneficial effect of farm work on his health, stating that for nearly 3 months he's been working extremely well and he'd rapidly recovered his health and strength. He returned home quite recovered, and the medical superintendent notes that he occasionally afterwards employed him as a labourer when he could not secure more regular work. Joseph's experience of the institutional farm enables us to understand how his occupational identity and worth as an agricultural worker went beyond that status of just being a patient in an institution. Not only did he retain his occupational identity within the constraints of institutional life, but he also repositioned himself as a worker on the institutional farm. After a period of working there as a patient, he went back as an employee as well. This contrasts with Gideon, who actively resists farm work. He's admitted to Lincoln Asylum in April 1864. He's an agricultural labourer again, and is admitted with mania and delusions. His mother was noted as stating that he was very restless and endeavouring to overcome the evil influences which he believes beset him. At times, he is violent and threatening. Now, families played a really key role in decisions over treatment and management of relatives, including the provision of information such as this on admission, and also on readmission as well, because often a patient may be discharged from the institution and then go back in at a later date as well because the family are concerned about them. 2 months later, an entry in his case note stated that he appears depressed, he talks despondingly, and does very little work. So they're making that sort of clear association that work and recovery go hand in hand, basically. A willingness to work was translated as progress in the recovery of a patient. Now, we do see this with Gideon. His case notes suggest that this occurs 5 months after his admission. He starts to work, he improves in his body and mind, and is employed occasionally on the wards. He's industrious on the wards, it says a few months later, and in good bodily health. So again, the mind and the body are being linked. However, on both occasions, explicit mention is made in his case notes to his refusal to work on the farm. So despite being an agricultural labourer, he's not seeking his customary occupation at any stage and is indeed actively refusing it. And this is interesting because perhaps it was that explicit contradiction that means they record this and it was worthy of recording, but it also means that there's that trace of the patient's reaction to the work being included in that document as well. So rather than representing a reassuring or familiar presence, it might trigger a negative reaction. We don't know what his experiences of agricultural labour outside of the institution had been either. For many patients, though, there's a rather non-linear pattern in their narrative. So many patients, it's their mental or physical condition that determines this. The patients were often noted to work well on the farm, and we see this with John Jay, whose case notes we have here from Lincoln again. Frequently working on the farm, works well on the farm, would seem fairly positive in that respect. However, we also see their own mental disorder coming to the forth, and you can't understand the two in isolation. So regardless of the fact that the farm is beneficial and quite positive, this patient is actually going up and down continuously in their experiences. We also get some who really have a negative experience of being on the farm as well. Either because of the farm work itself or some circumstances around the farm. We've got a particularly interesting one at Leicestershire County Lunatic Asylum in 1867, where Charles G., an agricultural labourer, was admitted. And his case notes indicate that he's been admitted on previous occasions. He keeps going back into the institution, often goes to work, no problems really. He's continuing to improve. Everything seems to be going fine. And then in January 1868, a few months after he's been there, it states that he was put to work to feed the pigs, and that on the following Monday said he felt so wretched at the dreadful crime he had committed of working on the Sabbath that he could not do anything more. He has been much more out of spirits since. Now, it seems in his instance, if we piece together the full story, that religion had a powerful hold over Charles. In this instance, it was not the farm work itself that had caused distress, but the timing of the work. Religion's mentioned several times in his case notes. He's recorded as a Baptist, and it states that he occasionally kneels down in the ward to pray when he is in for his dinner. And as an indication of improvement, it notes that has not been praying as at unreasonable times lately, which implies they think he has been doing at some other point as well. Farm work, particularly that involving animals, was naturally a daily occupation. The Anglican clergy had been long complaining that a large proportion of the labouring population didn't attend church because agricultural work and Sunday worship didn't really go hand in hand, because the working to feed animals or attend to livestock meant that labourers were not in church. Now, although Charles was no doubt aware of this, his religious beliefs, which are constantly referred to in these case notes, seem to be shaping his perceptions and thus his experiences, and how he expressed his experiences of that as well. Another example was a framesmith from Leicester, Albert. And Albert in 1896 and early 1897 was working on the farm, the institutional farm, but his case notes expressing exactly what he'd reported to the doctor was that he thinks he has a farm in his inside, can hear the hens cackling and the sheep bleating and the crows calling. So clearly the patient voice is being foregrounded here, albeit to illustrate what the doctors are saying is madness, but suggesting that farm work had a profound impact on something, that he wasn't accustomed to all the noise that he was experiencing in that sensory environment as well. Now, all in all, this would suggest that these patients are quite isolated. They're in this institutional environment and becoming quite institutionalized, but we don't necessarily see what's happening beyond that always. So we've got a couple of case studies that really do draw that out a little bit more, as well as some other examples and case studies to explore. So the first one that really connects the patient with life beyond the asylum is Robert G. Now, Robert is a patient in the Lincolnshire County Asylum, and it's basically a case study around delusions, or what the medical superintendents think is delusions. But we have his writing that's preserved as part of the case notes, and it's quite interesting to disentangle the case notes and the idea of delusion being written there to what we actually know about Robert's life outside of the institution and what was happening in the rural community as a whole. So, as I say, delusions were frequently recorded in patient records with a view to charting mental state, but little, if any, attention was paid to the realities underpinning them. Generally, no attempt was made to interpret or understand the basis of them, even though many of them were grounded in previous experiences of those patients before being admitted. But it's worth noting that many of them not only were rooted in reality, but as people started to understand them a little bit better, would start to acknowledge that as well. And certainly historians have started to realise there's a strong connection between the reality and the delusion by linking more documents together, not just what we've got from the institution. So this is a particularly distinctive case. He's admitted to the Lincolnshire County Asylum on multiple occasions from the late 1850s onwards. His case notes focus on a series of delusions relating to property, trade, and money. They not only related to past experiences before his first admission, but were also derived from intermittent time spent at home during a long period of confinement within the institution. And as I said, what makes it particularly unusual is the preservation of the voice through these handwritten notes that you can see on the screen here. So who was Robert then? Robert's a shoemaker who lives in the village of Bassingham in Lincolnshire. He was first admitted in December 1858 and discharged as recovered in April 1859. He's then readmitted in May 1864, and he's in and out basically till his death in 1878. And the delusions are mentioned in the case notes, particularly when he's readmitted, in terms of his behaviour and what he's talking about. So in 1864, they note he's incoherent, he's constantly walking about, seldom sleeps, and states he has ordered 6 journeymen to help him. And then in brackets, it says he has nothing to do but a little mending. Now, it's not entirely sure whether they're meaning he had little to do before he came in terms of his own shoemaking, or in terms of the institutional work, because he works in the shoemaker's workshop in the institution as well. But clearly, the delusions and his occupational identity are aligned. He also said, apparently, that he was going to open a public house and he's obtaining the necessary signatures. He's busy with circulars about shoemaking, has ordered leather and ironmongery, so enough to last a shop his life. So he's busy with business, and he's busy writing these documents whilst inside the institution. He then leaves again and comes back in June 1865. And at this time, it said he has delusions to the effect that he has property. People owe him money. He's offered property for sale to various persons. So there's all that going on. At the same time, his case notes are recording that he's very, very competent and industrious, doing work in the shoemaker's shop at the asylum. And there's a definite juxtaposition between that occupation-based delusion that we're hearing about, and then activity that's taking place both inside the asylum and outside the asylum during this period as well. What is perhaps interesting is the case notes never actually make that connection. There's no discussion of the relationship between the two of them. They're just being reported and recorded. If we then have a look at some of these documents on the screen to see what they're saying, and then try and take this step back and try and trace what his delusions are telling us and what his writings are telling us about him as a person as well. So he's clearly preoccupied with trade. There's a printed circular announcing a new branch of the York Tanning and Currying Company in Lincoln, dated the 29th of March, 1865. And this is covered with handwritten notes that he's made on various issues. He's written out a set of rules for a boot and shoe club, outlining the membership fees and the benefits, in line with many of the sort of mutual aid and friendly societies of the period, giving support in times of illness and difficulty. This is replicated in what he's writing here. He also writes the particulars for a most desirable freehold property in the improving village of Bassingham to be sold by auction. And a final note saying, I should like to see you on Friday and bring Mr. Rogers with you. So there's a whole series of these different things relating to 3 or 4 different topics that he's writing on this document that he's got. Now, the medical superintendent clearly sees sufficient significance in the document to retain it, not least perhaps because it's giving substance to the delusions that have been recorded elsewhere in the case notes. But at the heart of this is Robert and his narrative. He clearly retains that strong occupational identity, and we can see that non-institutional sources from both his time before admission and during admission tell us quite a lot. And and particularly a newspaper report in the Lincolnshire Chronicle a couple of years before his first admission, cautioning readers that a Jeremy Diddler had been victimising the tradesmen of Bassingham and the vicinity to an unusual extent and in a rather clever manner. So a Jeremy Diddler was referring to a literary character who borrowed money but did not repay it. And the report went on to state that he paid sundry visits to most of the brewers, grocers, shoemakers, millers in the district, causing anxiety to several of the above tradesmen. Now, as a resident shoemaker, Robert would be acutely aware of this, if not directly affected, and it may have been the catalyst for his constant preoccupation with property, money, and trade thereafter, particularly as there wasn't long between this instance and his first admission to the asylum. It certainly suggests that there was an underlying anxiety fueled by real life experiences that was fueling that delusionary behaviour as well. Money worries, whether they're real or imagined, were a known source of distress which could lead to mental disorders and admission to asylums. To some extent, we may never entirely disentangle Robert's delusions from his life experiences, but his case notes highlight how patients could narrate their own institutional experiences through their actions, reactions, and particularly through their own written accounts. And that as historians, we can take a step back and look at the whole picture rather than just that preoccupation at the time. So far, we've been talking about patients working on the farm without really thinking too much about what type of work they were doing whilst they were there. So narratives of patient labour frequently talk about it as if it's a homogeneous activity, suggesting perhaps a tacit understanding of what this entailed, but what precise nature of work were they undertaking and how do we know? Now, to a certain extent, this was determined by the nature of farming being undertaken by the institution, the size and extent of the paid workforce being employed, and the suitability of the patients for different tasks. The work would often be that deemed as unskilled agricultural labour in rural communities, and sometimes that would be undertaken by women and children in rural communities, but not always. It did vary considerably. In addition to the occasional references in case notes, other sources such as annual reports, committee minutes, and newspaper reports provide glimpses into the working lives of patients on the farm. And some focus on individual patients, and this is when we can perhaps, really sort of see what was an individual patient doing by looking at those examples. So in 1869, Dr. John Kirkman wrote in the annual report of the Suffolk Lunatic Asylum about a patient who watched over the cows night and day. The paragraph opened by asserting that foot and mouth disease had seized all the cows a few weeks earlier, but he added they all did well, being attended by the vet. However, he goes on to explain the role of this unnamed patient whose services are in constant demand on the farm and who had been employed daily for 28 years. The attentiveness that this patient showed to the cows extended to other animals as well, and he explains that the patient was the donkey driver who showed remarkable care to the animal. There was definitely an emotional attachment here, notably enough to compel the medical superintendent to elaborate at length about the patient and his work. Kirkman described the patient as a man of feeling who showed kindness to the beast. This manifested itself through daily actions and behaviour, including wrapping the animal up at night as a nurse would do a baby, and then at first light in the morning, finding the patient at his door. Extracts from this annual report were reprinted in a local newspaper, including several lines relating to this patient. It talks about his tender treatment of the asylum donkey as being very amusing. They expressed the opinion that if the patient should be allowed to, he would share his bed with the animal. Now they're sort of being quite, they're not ridiculing it, but they are sort of making light of the situation. And it would have appealed to a Victorian readership who were fascinated with madness. But in doing so, they underestimate the depth of kinship being felt there, and the complex relationship between animals and farm workers. Because here, that companionship and responsibility meant an awful lot to that one patient, and definitely shaped not only their experience, but things that they said about their experience whilst they were there as well, and the way they reacted throughout. Annual reports frequently also had to quantify patient labour, and they would say how many men and women were working. And this is where we start to see a little bit more about female patients through what type of work they were doing. So weeding, picking stones, assisting in the gathering of crops, sometimes at harvest time as well. But it's not until the virtual closure of these farms in the 50s onwards that we sort of see a wider range of occupations coming to the fore. Now, this is interesting because there's a 1954 circular which basically is wanting to close down all of the farms on these institutions. But patient work is cited as a significant factor in institutions wanting to maintain their farmland. This was despite the circular asserting that farming had undergone considerable change, including mechanisation and the increased complexities of milk production, which it had argued made it more difficult to employ patients on the land. According to a letter, and we have it on the screen here, patients assisted with nearly all of the farming activities at Warwick Asylum. And you can see them there listed. There's so many. There's haymaking, harvesting, hoeing, potato picking, poultry keeping, milking, root cultivation and gathering, threshing, pig tending, dairying, vegetable and potato sorting, carrying, carting, cleaning, digging, chopping and milling, horse tending, stacking and ricking, crow scaring, fetching and carrying, and muck spreading. And there's other reports as well that basically say patients are engaged on almost all ordinary work except machine tractor driving and those sorts of work. So anything that was manual, anything that could be done without a machine, they were arguing patients could and did do into the 1950s as well. We also find out quite a lot about where these patients lived as well, because you might just assume, well, they're just going out to work each day. Now, many of them did, to be fair. Many of them just went out from the main institution, out to work and back again. However, we've got quite a lot of documentation that tells us that some patients, the farm was also their home as well. And with a few asylums going on to either construct a new building or convert an existing farm building to accommodate them. The rationale for this varied, partially to ease pressure on beds in the main building to save money, close proximity to work to save time, but greater distance from the new admissions as well. So as people were improving, they weren't with the new people that were being admitted as well. The example on the screen relates to the West Sussex County Asylum. And we can see there the main institution towards the bottom of the map, and then just to the top we've got the farm and the farmhouse, and the kitchen garden behind that and all the fields surrounding it. To the side we've got the agreement that will be what leads to the conversion of the farmhouse into accommodation for patients as well. So in July 1896, the medical superintendent of Graylingwell in West Sussex proposed the conversion of the farmhouse for use by patients who worked on the farm. The house was described as a substantial two-storey property with 6 bays and an additional wing and attic accommodation. Plans for conversion were approved on the 30th of October 1896. This was to accommodate 16, and I quote, quiet and harmless patients who would be specially selected from among the cleanly, quiet and well-conducted class. So not only were patients being carefully selected to work on the farm in the first instance, but here's a further filter being applied to those who would live in this accommodation as well. So it's shaped by the classification and categorization of patients, highlighting the importance of behavioural traits and conduct as well. The second annual report noted that the converted farmhouse opened on the 8th of October 1898 for 15 patients, asserting that they are comfortable and enjoy their comparative freedom and work willingly. They are well looked after by the bailiff and his wife, Mr. and Mrs. Peacock. And there's a real emphasis there on the comparative freedom. And this is quite significant, both in terms of a stimulus to work. Why would somebody want to go and work on the farm? Well, they might see it as a way to live in a separate part of the institution and be separate and have a more domestic setting, but also as a factor in shaping patient identity and how they navigated institutional spaces as well. Because they're still within the overall institutional boundaries, but it's a distinct institutional space that's got those occupational attributes as well. The distance between the main institution and farm was also highlighted as significant in the construction of a farm residence at Victorian Asylum in the West Riding of Yorkshire in 1897. Here, the county surveyor wrote to the lunacy commissioners on the 27th of October 1897, outlining the practical implications of farm patients being housed about half a mile from the farm. He explained that they have to get up at 5 o'clock to be ready for work at 6, milking cows and attending to the farm, and then they have to come back into the institution for their breakfast and all the other meals. It was argued that the proposed new residence would mean that patients would be closer to their work, able to get up later, and be better supervised in many ways. He explained that this meant that 36 additional beds would be obtained at a cheaper cost than those in the main institution and relieve beds for new admissions. The total cost would be £122 per bed. And this was compared to, it was almost half, compared to £240 in the main building. The lunacy commissioners say it's far too expensive and go away and come back, and there's a long sort of legal wrangling around there. Eventually they go ahead because they're basically saying this will save money in the long run, but also create more efficient workers because they'll be closer to this. So for patients living and working on the farm, it creates this occupational community in which the space, the routine and language used to describe them, because they're often then referred to as farm patients rather than inmates, which distinguishes them from other people. However, within all this context, this is quite positive. A lot of people are enjoying it. They've got separate living arrangements. We could talk about the benefits they get as well in terms of extra allowances like beer. So why do so many people then escape from the farm as well? So I suppose it's more seeing the farm as constituting a space that facilitated those opportunities for patients to escape from the institution. There's evidence of escapes in annual reports, minutes, reports or case notes. They're often fleeting. They simply note that a patient escapes, and the focus is on how quickly can they get them back into the institution as well. But occasionally we find some more interesting stories, such as 2 patients who escaped over the farm, disappeared, and we actually get the story of the patient who gets returned. So essentially 2 patients go, one is seen as the one who's led the other one away, but worn out with fatigue and by the want of proper nourishment, the other patient gives himself up to the police, and then this provides an opportunity for to tell his story, which, although paraphrased in the report, highlights the insights into patient experience. So he talks about how they went unnoticed in the stream of hop pickers passing through the county. He talks about how one of the other companions' relatives had helped them and got them employment, that they were unsuspecting of who they were, employed them cutting beans. Talks about how the other money took all the money that they earned for himself, and refusing to give him any, compelled him to subsist on almost entirely swedes. So through that experience, he starts to tell his story in his own words as well. And obviously then he's returned. We also find a little bit more out about the other man who, understanding that this man's going to give himself up, goes off and hides. But then the medical superintendent points out that that patient, who they never get back into the asylum, did, however, send back the clothes that he'd been wearing, neatly packed and washed, and that he has got a job now and he's getting on quite well. So it seemed in the institution they wanted to say, oh, well, he was going to be released anyway. He was a good man, because basically they'd lost him. But the other man was weaker and they needed to get him back, and he returned. But it's through that experience we actually get his words. There's one more person I want to share with you, and that's Elliot. Now, most of the newspaper reports focus on Vera, a young girl who was murdered in Chichester, near Chichester, in the 1920s. The murders remains unsolved. It's an 11 and a half year old girl. But the inquest and subsequent newspaper reports tell us an awful lot about Elliot, because Elliot was a farm worker and a patient on the asylum. He's the one who finds the body as well. And it tells us a really fascinating story. He's described as a deaf mute at the time, who was employed on the farm, and his experience of navigating that space and that work using non-verbal communication. It details his regular activities, so we can tell that he delivers the milk from the farm to the house of the steward every morning, that the steward's right on the edge of the estate, and that's the main road into Chichester runs along that way. That this abuts a public road where soldiers and civilians often walk with girls, and that usually he just does this very effectively. But this particular morning he was agitated and kept just gesticulating, laying his head on one side and on his folded hands as if to indicate someone sleeping. Another patient, based on previous interactions with Elliot, assumed that somebody had passed away in the institution. However, Elliot's still agitated. He goes to the dairy where the farm bailiff's wife is, and again, he's trying to communicate what he needs to do. Eventually, they bring in two so-called deaf and dumb experts at the time who want to talk to him and have no, that doesn't work either. But the farm bailiff is able to work out what's going on, because he explains that Elliot often told him in his own way of happenings on the farm. Although he didn't communicate the same way as other people, he was capable of making himself fairly well understood and was not feeble-minded to the degree that some of the reports were making out. This suggests that over time, Elliot, the farm bailiff, and his wife and other patients that he regularly worked with had constructed a frame of reference which meant that they could communicate effectively. Moreover, through these reports and additional reports, we get the sense that Elliot was an integral part of life on the farm. And in contrast to the official reports that suggest only focus on his mental state, the institutional records from the farm patients and the farm workers and the farm bailiff give us a far more insight into his how valuable he was to the institution as well. So hopefully that's given you some insights into just how complex farm work was and how patients experienced it. But also that even where we don't have the diaries and letters of patients, we can hear their words, we can hear their voices, we can see their writing, we can see pictures of them. And even where we have to dig even deeper, and look at institutional records to read sort of backwards and against the grain, we do see them, and they don't need to be marginalized. We need to bring them to the fore because they performed a valuable role in these institutions. The question of whether they were exploited varies considerably, and there's a lot of debate about that, but basically, yes, they are such interesting people to know more about. So thank you.